Tomb Raider is one of those franchises that feel almost inseparable from gaming history. Lara Croft has survived dinosaurs, ancient tombs, supernatural threats, multiple console generations, several different versions of herself, and apparently the video game industry's endless desire to remaster everything. But Nintendo players had a strangely long wait for one particular chapter of her story. More than 12 years after its original release, 2013's Tomb Raider finally arrived on Nintendo hardware through Tomb Raider Definitive Edition for Switch and Switch 2. And as a disabled Nintendo gamer, I was especially curious about this one, because this isn't simply a question of, is Tomb Raider still good? It's also, is this actually a good Switch 2 version? And perhaps more importantly for this channel, how accessible is Lara's survival adventure more than a decade later? Because Tomb Raider still does some things incredibly well. Other parts make those 12 years painfully obvious. So grab your bow, check that the zipline is actually going somewhere safe, and welcome back to CtrlAble. Today we're dissecting Tomb Raider Definitive Edition on Nintendo Switch 2. This isn't the confident Lara Croft who occasionally wades ancient ruins because Tuesday was looking a little boring. This is an origin story. Lara is 21 years old and traveling aboard the Endurance in search of the lost kingdom of Yamatai. Things go wrong almost immediately. The ship is destroyed. Lara and her friends are stranded. The island doesn't seem interested in letting anyone leave, and Lara quickly discovers that surviving Yamatai means dealing with violent cultists, hostile wildlife, environmental hazards, supernatural mysteries, and apparently having every sharp object on the island personally introduced to her ribcage. Seriously, this game beats the absolute crap out of Lara. She gets impaled, she falls from ridiculous heights, she gets caught in traps, she's shot, she's beaten, she's dragged through mud, blood, caves, wreckage, freezing water. I don't know how Lara survived Yamatai. I don't know how her immune system survived Yamatai. But from the beginning, Crystal Dynamics clearly wanted this adventure to feel desperate. And visually and atmospherically, it works. Yamatai means an incredibly compelling setting. Storms surround the island. Ancient structures sit alongside military installations and a wet ship. The environment slowly reveals evidence of people who became trapped there long before Lara arrived. And there are moments where Tomb Raider gets surprisingly close to survival horror. Dark caves, bodies hanging from ceilings, rooms filled with blood and human remains, enemies stalking Lara like she's vulnerable. This is easily one of the darkest interpretations of Tomb Raider, and despite its age, that atmosphere remains effective. Here's where things become complicated, because Tomb Raider came out in 2013, and if you're playing big budget games around that time, you can practically see the checklist. Cover-based shooting? Check. Quick-time events? Check. Crafting and weapon upgrades? Check. Detective vision? We call it survival instinct here, but check. Huge cinematic set pieces where everything explodes while your character desperately runs toward the camera? Oh, absolutely check. And looming over everything is Uncharted. Nathan Drake had already become one of the biggest names in cinematic action-adventure games, and Tomb Raider clearly borrowed from that formula, sometimes heavily. There are stretches of this game where Lara spends far more time shooting people than actually raiding tombs. Ironically, many of the actual tombs are optional. Imagine buying a game called Tomb Raider and the tomb raiding is side content. That's certainly a decision. But here's the frustrating part. The gameplay is really good. Combat remains satisfying. The bow in particular is fantastic. You can quietly eliminate enemies, create distractions, use environmental hazards, or abandon subtlety entirely and start putting arrows into everybody who made the mistake of joining the world's and worst island vacation. Weapons gradually improve. Lara gains new traversal equipment. Previously inaccessible parts of Yamatai open up, and the island is structured intelligently enough that returning to older areas rarely feels like you're wandering through enormous empty spaces. This was before every game needed a map large enough to qualify as its own country. Tomb Raider has open environments without becoming a traditional open world game, and I actually appreciate that. You have room to explore, you have collectibles, you have optional tombs, you have challenges, but the game still knows where you're supposed to go. For accessibility, that structure can actually be helpful. And this is where we get into the part of the conversation that matters most to me. I am legally blind, so whenever I'm playing something like Tomb Raider, I'm not simply looking at whether the combat feels good. I'm looking at how effectively the game communicates information. Can I determine where I'm supposed to go? Can I identify objects? Can I see enemies? Can I read what the game is giving me? And Tomb Raider is an interesting mixture of helpful design and very outdated accessibility thinking. Let's start with one of the biggest advantages. Survival Instinct highlights important elements within the environment. Objectives, interactive objects, enemies, certain navigation point. For someone with limited vision, this kind of feature can be incredibly useful. And yes, people sometimes complain about these vision modes, thinking exploration too easy. But this is exactly why accessibility conversations need more nuance than simply asking whether something reduces difficulty. What one player ignores might be the feature that helps another player understand the environment. For me, giving important objects stronger visual separation from their surroundings is valuable, especially because Yamatai can get visually busy. You've got foliage, ruins, wooden structures, dark caves, rain, fire, debris, enemies wearing colors that can blend into the environment. A lot is happening on screen. Unfortunately, Survival Instinct doesn't solve everything, and I don't mean emotionally. Although, yes, that too. I mean literally dark. Several reviewers specifically criticized how dark and gray certain environments can become. As a legally blind player, I noticed that immediately. No contrast can turn environmental navigation from exploration into, okay Lara, apparently we're staring at a wall now. The smaller handheld display can make that problem worse. Yes, being able to play Tomb Raider on the go is cool, but portability doesn't automatically mean accessibility. When information has already been compressed into a smaller screen, subtle environmental details become even harder for someone with reduced vision to distinguish. Personally, this is the kind of game where I would lean toward playing dots whenever possible. A larger display gives me more room to work with, and that matters because Tomb Raider doesn't have the type of extensive modern visual accessibility suite we've started seeing elsewhere. You're not getting customizable high contrast modes. You're not getting comprehensive interface scaling. You're not getting different highlight colors from multiple gameplay elements. You're playing a game fundamentally designed in 2013, and sometimes it absolutely feels like one. Combat creates another accessibility conversation. Tomb Raider rewards precision. Headshots matter. The bow frequently asks you to hit relatively small targets, and enemies aren't always standing politely in front of Lara waiting for their turn. This should have made Switch 2 gyro aiming a fantastic addition. Nintendo players are already accustomed to motion-assisted aiming. Splatoon, Zelda, Metroid Prime. Plenty of examples show how gyro can give players precision beyond what an analog stick provides. Unfortunately, the implementation here is bizarrely limited. At launch, reviewers found gyro being used for things like manipulating relics or menu interactions rather than becoming a proper aiming solution. That's such a missed opportunity, especially from an accessibility perspective. Alternative input methods aren't simply gimmicks. Different people physically interact with controllers differently. Someone may struggle with fine analog stick movements but perform better using motion. Another player might hate motion controls entirely. Accessibility comes from having choices. Give me stick aiming. Give someone else gyro. Give another player mouse controls. Let people use what works. The Switch 2 version supports Joy-Con 2 mouse functionality, which sounds interesting on paper, but reviewers found the implementation awkward and imprecise. So Tomb Raider technically has several different control ideas, but doesn't fully capitalize on the accessibility potential of any of them. Then we have the fossils preserved perfectly from the early 2010s. Break time events? If Tomb Raider suddenly flashes a button on a screen, you need to react. Sometimes rapidly, sometimes repeatedly, and failure can immediately kill Lara. Modern games frequently let players change repeated button presses into hold. Sometimes allow longer timing windows. Some automate specific QTEs. Some let you disable them entirely. Tomb Raider doesn't provide that kind of flexibility. For players with motor disabilities, reduced reaction speed, fatigue, or difficulty processing sudden visual prompts. That's a legitimate barrier, and I think it's important to distinguish that from difficulty. Missing a QTE because you made a wrong decision is one thing. Missing it because the game requires a physical input you struggle to perform is something completely different. Accessibility options don't remove the game's challenge. They allow more people to interact with that challenge. And Tomb Raider could absolutely do better here. Another product of 2013? The camera apparently believes it's being filmed by somebody sprinting behind Lara. There's a lot of shaking. During cutscenes, during action sequences, sometimes during regular gameplay. It creates intensity, but intensity is automatically comfortable. Camera shake can create problems for players who experience motion sickness, headache, visual fatigue, or difficulty tracking moving imagery. And the Switch 2 port doesn't give players enough control over that presentation. This is one of those situations where keeping the original artistic direction is fine. Keep camera shaking as the default, but give players an option to reduce it. That doesn't destroy Tomb Raider. It simply means somebody who gets physically uncomfortable from excessive screen movement could still enjoy Lara's adventure. Now we need to talk about one of Tomb Raider's 2013's most famous arguments, ludonarrative dissonance. Don't worry. I promise CtrlAble hasn't transformed into a college lecture. Basically, people have argued for years that there's a disconnect between the Lara presented in cutscenes and the Lara you're controlling. Story Lara is terrified after being forced to kill someone. Gameplay Lara, approximately 5 minutes later, apparently I have become John Wick. She becomes extremely effective with firearms and a bow very quickly. She can stealth kill experienced enemies. She can perform difficulty and ridiculous climbing maneuvers. She upgrades weapons. She survives encounters that would make most human beings resign from adventuring immediately. Some reviewers still find that transition jarring. Others have argued that action stories have always allowed protagonists to adapt ridiculously quickly across violence whenever it begins. I can understand both interpretations. For me, the stranger disconnect happens during exploration. The story regularly tells you that Laura's friends are in immediate danger. And meanwhile, Lara can wander off because I found a GPS cache. Sorry, Sam. You'll have to survive another 20 minutes. There's a collectible over here. That's not something unique to Tomb Raider. Games constantly ask us to ignore urgent narratives while we search someone's kitchen cupboards for crafting materials. But because this story is so relentlessly focused on desperation and survival, the contrast becomes easier to notice. Another element is harder to ignore in 2026. This game is obsessed with hurting Lara, not simply putting her in danger, hurting her repeatedly. Graphic death animation, impaling, crushing, strangulation, falls, wounds, blood. At times, the game almost seems fascinated by how brutally it can punish its protagonist. And several critics have revisited that element differently now than they did in 2013. There's a legitimate discussion here about the difference between showing Laura's vulnerability and repeatedly using her suffering as spectacle. I understand what Crystal Dynamics was trying to communicate. This isn't the experienced Tomb Raider yet. This is someone discovering she can survive impossible circumstances. But sometimes the game pushes so far that Lara starts feeling vulnerable and starts feeling indestructible. Because after watching someone survive her 15th catastrophic injury, I'm no longer thinking, wow, Lara is in danger. I'm thinking, apparently Lara Croft cannot die. and suddenly the intended realism starts working against itself. Now let's talk specifically about Nintendo, because this is where reviews became extremely divided. Some reviewers found the Switch 2 version disappointing, others thought it was excellent. And weirdly, both sides have a point. Performance is one of its biggest strengths. The Switch 2 version targets 60 frames per second, and reviewers consistently found its performance impressively stable. For an action game built around shooting, climbing, quick reactions, and huge cinematic consequences and sequences, 60 FPS feels great. In visual quality, took noticeable cuts compared with previous versions. Reviewers pointed out reduced shadows, simplified lighting, lower quality environmental elements, strange differing or hatching on foliage, textures that sometimes look noticeably dated, and at launch the famous Tress FX hair technology was missing entirely. That last part was fortunately changed. Aspire updated the Switch 2 edition in May 2026 and added Tress FX 1.0. So if you see older reviews complaining that Lara's advanced hair rendering isn't here, that criticism is now outdated. And I want to give Aspire credit for addressing it, because post-launch improvements matter. Still, adding better hair doesn't magically restore every missing visual feature. This remains an unusual port. The Switch 2 is significantly more capable than the original Switch. We've already seen much more demanding games running surprisingly well on Nintendo's hardware, so it's understandable that people looked at a 2013 game and expected more. For me, yes and no. I will take readable gameplay over individual strands of Lara Croft's hair every single time. If the choice is between amazing hair physics at an unstable frame rate, or simpler hair with responsive 60 FPS gameplay, give me the smooth game. But graphical reductions can become accessibility problems when they affect environmental clarity. Missing shadows? Usually not a huge accessibility concern for me. A texture being slightly lower resolution? Probably fine. Foliage becoming visually noisy or developing distracting patterns? Now I care. Objects blending into environments? I care. Dark areas having poor visibility? Absolutely care. Graphics and accessibility aren't separate conversations. Sometimes graphical fidelity provides information, and sometimes graphical effects actively obscure it. The useful question isn't, does the game look pretty? It's, can I clearly understand what I'm looking at? Accessibility reviews should discuss that more often. Fortunately, underneath all those cynical arguments, Tomb Raider is still incredibly entertaining. The set pieces are fantastic. Buildings collapse. Lara escapes explosions. Structures crumble underneath her. You slide down mountains. You cross enormous gaps. You climb a video tower that I absolutely do not want anything to do with in real life. The pacing generally keeps moving. And unlike many modern games, Tomb Raider doesn't expect 80 hours of your life before getting to the point. Something is refreshing about that. The progression system is simple enough to understand. Weapon upgrades feel meaningful. Exploration provides useful rewards. Fast travel allows you to revisit previous locations, and the optional content usually stays close enough to the main path that exploring doesn't destroy the pacing. I also appreciate that the game isn't buried underneath endless systems. There isn't a battle pass. There isn't a daily login bonus. There aren't 15 currencies. Lara doesn't stop halfway through Yamatai to remind you that the Tomb Raider Premium Survival Bundle is available for 1500 Croft coins. You buy the game, you play the game. There is something increasingly pleasant about revisiting games from an era when that wasn't remarkable. This might be the hardest question, because as an action-adventure game, yes, absolutely. As a traditional Tomb Raider experience, that's more complicated. Classic Lara was confident, adventurous. She enjoyed exploring dangerous places. Tombs were central to her identity. This Lara spends most of her first adventure desperately trying to survive. And because this game followed the cinematic design trends established by Uncharted, sometimes Lara Croft feels like she's starring in somebody else's game. The optional tombs are fun. I wish there were more. Later games in the Survivor trilogy would expand the puzzle and tomb element significantly. Here, combat dominates. If you want an atmospheric third-person action game starring Lara Croft, there's a lot to love. If you want the classic puzzle-heavy Tomb Raider formula, this probably isn't what you're imagining. Both opinions can coexist. This can be a very good game, while also being a strange interpretation of Tomb Raider. So where does that leave disabled players? There are some genuinely useful elements. Survival instinct can make objectives and environmental elements easier to identify. Difficulty options make combat more manageable. The relatively focused level structure reduces some navigation problems that enormous open worlds can create. Subtitles help with dialogue. The game generally communicates its primary objectives clearly, and the Switch 2's smooth performance helps keep controls responsive. But compared with modern accessibility expectations, a lot is missing. Limited interface customization, no comprehensive high contrast system, no meaningful text scaling suite, no proper gyro aiming despite the hardware supporting motion input, awkward mouse implementation, no extensive QT accessibility options, no option to significantly reduce the aggressive camera shake. Environments can become extremely dark or visually cluttered. None of those individually make Tomb Raider inaccessible to every disabled player. Disability isn't one experience. What works for me as a legally blind player may not work for someone with a motor disability. What helps a deaf player may have nothing to do with what helps someone with motion sickness. That's exactly why accessibility needs options, and Tomb Raider doesn't provide enough of them. It isn't necessarily because somebody maliciously ignored disabled players. This is fundamentally a 2013 game carrying much of its original design into 2026. But preserving an old game doesn't mean accessibility has to stay frozen in the past. Ports are opportunities, and I wish Aspyr had treated accessibility as part of modernizing Tomb Raider. If Nintendo hardware is your primary place to play games and you're never experienced Tomb Raider 2013, this is still a compelling way to play it finally, especially on Switch 2. You get smooth performance, portable play, the campaign, its additional content, online multiplayer assuming you can actually find people, and now the improved Tress FX hair rendering that wasn't available when the port originally launched. The Switch 2 release has also received post-launch performance and bug fixes, so the version available today isn't identical to what reviewers played in November 2025. But if you already own Tomb Raider elsewhere, that's harder. The Nintendo release doesn't suddenly transform the game. Its main advantage is bringing Lara Survivor Origin to Nintendo hardware and letting you carry it around. And for some people, that's enough. Not every port needs to become the unquestioned best version ever created. But when you're calling something the Definitive Edition, people will understandably expect something reasonably definitive. Tomb Raider Definitive Edition is fascinating because I came away thinking about two completely different eras of game design. The game itself represents 2013, cinematic action, quick time events, cover shooting, survivor vision, huge set pieces, relentless protagonist suffering, and industries trying to recreate the success of games like Uncharted. The Switch 2 version represents another question entirely. What should we expect when publishers bring those games to the next generation? Is simply making them run at 60 frames per second enough? Should accessibility features be modernized? Should graphics be rebuilt around newer hardware? How much should a port preserve? And how much should it improve? For me, Tomb Raider Definitive Edition remains a strong action-adventure trapped inside a surprisingly basic modernization. Lara's first journey across Helmatai is exciting. The combat still works. The bow is still satisfying. The environments remain atmospheric. The set pieces remain spectacular. and the more focused structure actually feels refreshing after years of enormous open world. But accessibility hasn't aged nearly as gracefully. As a legally blind Nintendo gamer, survival instinct helped me tremendously. At the same time, darker environments, limited customization, visual clutter, camera shake, QTEs, and underused alternative control options repeatedly reminded me that I was playing something designed under very different accessibility expectations. That's why preservation and accessibility should be working together. I want old games preserved. I want new generations to experience them. But I also want disabled players who couldn't comfortably experience these games 13 years ago to have a better chance today. A remaster doesn't need to rewrite history. It can simply open that history to more people. And Lara Croft has spent 30 years proving that seemingly impossible obstacles can be overcome. Accessibility deserves that same philosophy. Nothing wasted. I'm Michael. This is CtrlAble, and I'll see you in the next dissection. But now I want to hear from you. When an older game is brought to modern hardware, should developers preserve the original experience exactly as it was, or use the opportunity to add modern accessibility options? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoy looking at games through the perspective of disabled and Nintendo players, consider subscribing to CtrlAble. I'll see you next time.